publishing, and particularly publishing in the Holy Trinity or the very top journals, it really needs to be examined. And the reason I say that is that the research shows that the more information you have, the less you fall back on unconscious bias. And the less information you have and the more cursory a review, or the more distracted you are, the more likely you are to rely on bias, which makes sense. That's your gut feeling comes into play if you don't have the facts. And the 4 top journals that I mentioned before all use a 2-tier review. And the first step is, will they even send it out for review? And it's made based on editors who are not expert in your field, most likely. They often will just read the abstract, and they're looking at the author's name. And I think that if those 4 journals tried blind review at the first stage only, because there are all sorts of reasons why they argue they can't do it at the second stage, but if they just did it at the first stage, and basically the editor sat around with abstracts from all the papers that were coming in, the way they do at most of these journals, they sit and they discuss them as a group, and they had the abstracts and titles with no authors, I would bet that we would see a very surprising trend. We would see more junior people publishing in those journals, we would see more women, more minorities, and more people coming in from outside the field, because I think there's prejudice against people who are not currently in the field. That's my pitch.
So I actually am a managing editor for a journal, not in any of the fields we would like to publish in, but I'm the person who verifies that we are going to have a double-blind review. We maintain a double-blind review for the first review of every journal article. And I'm just wondering what the argument is against that. I mean, science, nature, et cetera. I mean, it would be hard to argue that they don't have the funds to support somebody like me who's like, oh wait, that's your name. Please take it back and take that out, and then we can submit it for review.
You know, it was interesting when I submitted the bias paper to Science. The editor, who I know fairly well, wrote back this note that the quote will be over my desk for the rest of my career. Albeit sad, there is nothing surprising in these results. And my response was, well, then why the hell haven't you changed your reviewing process? If this is so well known, how do you engage in that kind of bias on a daily basis? And of course, I didn't get an answer. So no, there's no excuse, and I think there's even less excuse now that this paper is out, because they can't use the scientists don't do this thing. And we did it across fields in science, and there was no difference among the fields, so it's likely to extend to engineering and math and every other field that might want to publish in those journals. And so I don't think they have excuses anymore. And I think that tenure committees have to take this into account pretty seriously as well. That, you know, if women are being discriminated against at every level, and I think there's reason to believe that this result is extrapolatable to lots of levels, then you can't just count the science and nature papers the way many people would like to do to decide whether somebody is prominent or visible or high quality enough. There's no excuse. If anyone comes up with an excuse of why we shouldn't do blind review at that first stage, I'd love to hear it, because I can't.
Okay. We'll allow a change of conversation a little bit. I don't know if that's there.
I didn't mean to dominate that discussion.
On a more positive note, I'm still surviving. Right? So I still have faith in the system, and I have faith that if I produce good science, I will be able to publish my work. So don't be discouraged.
We're all still here.
Exactly.
You know, and one thing that I just want to say, because it's not said enough to young people, is we have the best job in the world. I mean, being a scientist in an academic setting is just the absolute best thing you can possibly do. It's just the constant opportunity to work with fabulous young people, to affect people's lives, and to be intellectually stimulated and challenged and have fun all at the same time. So none of us say that enough. You hear all the negatives, you hear all your PIs grumbling about grants and all the papers being rejected and all that stuff. So I just want to interject that. But I think it is realistic to say that women do have a disadvantage. And I say that not to be discouraging, but it may come back to you someday and build your confidence. And the reason I say that is, for 30 years in science, every time I got a paper rejected from any place or a grant not funded, I blamed it on myself. And I would say all the things that I find out now every woman basically says, which is, oh, it wasn't good enough, it was flawed, taking all the responsibility. And there's research that shows that women are much more likely to blame themselves for lack of success. Men are much more likely to blame circumstances. And you can imagine the cumulative effect on women's self-confidence if every time there's that barrier in the way, it becomes blame to the self. You start convincing yourself you're not good enough. And so the reason I think this work is so important to talk about with women, not to be discouraging and negative, the bias is there. It's always been there and it will be there. Talking about the paper isn't going to suddenly make it worse. What it will do is hopefully occasionally remind you that it may not be you. And none of us wants, as scientists, wants to blame something else because we have a sample size of 1. So we don't want to say, well, it was prejudice. But hopefully, occasionally, you'll give yourself a pat on the back by reminding yourself that it might not be you that's the problem. It might be the system. Or if you had had a man's name, perhaps your paper would have been accepted or your grant would have been funded. And I think that's the most important thing to come out of this is confidence building.
I think that's huge because I think especially at early stages like you are, you can really internalize that. And so not only will it, you take that feedback and just feel bad about yourself, but it can actually hamper your productivity. So I can't tell you how many, I can tell you I have 5 papers that I should send out, but I've sent them out once and they were rejected and I'm just sitting on them because I'm so worried about getting another rejection and I don't want to be rejected again, right? How many times do you want to hear, oh, that was crap? So it can really hamper your productivity because I know, and I've had this conversation with my male counterparts who say, oh, I would just turn that around a week later because they don't know what they're talking about. So really not internalizing and realizing that there are external forces that may not be giving you a fair shot all the time or just, there are other journals, there are other people to review this. Is probably a huge point to make sure that you're as productive as you can be.
Sorry, I didn't mean to try to derail anything. So in talking with a number of faculty and a number of my peers, I've had conflicting messages about whether or not we should submit a pre-submission to a journal. And I'd love to hear your guys' positions on whether or not we should pursue a pre-submission before we go for a formal submission.
It may be a bit field specific, so I can really just sort of address my field in biology. I don't think, so first of all, I would, before I thought about a pre-submission anywhere, I'd go and read the journal, write-up very explicitly to see. Some journals really encourage pre-submission. In fact, they won't consider things without a pre-submission inquiry. A lot of other journals suggest it but don't mandate it. So, in those cases, I would definitely do it. But it's not always apparent just from the face page of the journal's website. You really have to dig through the instructions to authors part. That being said, I don't think it's ever a bad idea to necessarily inquire to an editor or editor-in-chief over the appropriateness of your paper, of your manuscript for a particular journal. The worst, I think, that could happen is you get sort of a wishy-washy response. That, well, go ahead and send it in. We'll see what happens. That may, in the end, waste your time, but if you think the journal is the appropriate venue for your manuscript, then you should be sending it there anyways. So I don't think there's ever really, I don't think that's ever going to hamper you other than it may delay you in terms of time.
I think you don't want to overuse, just as the editor-in-chief, former editor-in-chief of a couple of journals, I don't think you want to overuse that mechanism if it's really obvious that it's mainstream to the journal. You know, if it's a specialty journal and there have been 50 other studies like yours, differences published that year, then it'll look contrived. So I would stay away from that. However, I would say that if you can start a dialogue, particularly with the high-profile journals that are a lot more capricious about what they want, you may be able to get a paper in that wouldn't have been in otherwise. And sometimes the dialogue is really important because the editor, after giving you advice, starts taking some ownership for the paper. And there are shades of gray in every submission and every review process. There's no perfect paper, and there's no paper that flies through without somebody making some subjective judgment. And so if you can have that subjectivity kind of go your way a little bit, that's a very good thing to have. And ownership is the best way to achieve that. And men do that much more often than women, and that's been shown. And so that's something to remember, that it's very hard for a lot of women to screw up their courage to have a conversation with an editor, or to challenge a decision, or to call a program manager at their funding agency. And those are absolutely necessary things. I was shocked when I found out after 20 years of submitting grants that all my male colleagues had these relationships with the program managers, and I had never spoken to one. So don't be like me.
Could we just clarify what exactly a pre-submission is? I'm sorry if everyone else knows, but I'm not too sure what that is.
Why don't you tell us what you meant by it, so we make sure we're
Right, so,
answering.
and as you mentioned, some journals strongly recommend the pre-submission, others don't, but basically it's a short document, generally like a cover letter, an abstract, and depending on the journal, maybe even some figure legends, debatable. But the idea is that it's something that you send to the editor, they read through it, and they tell you whether or not they feel that that article or that project is suitable for their journal, before you go through the process of actually submitting, formatting and submitting a full article. Generally, according to the journals that I looked at, generally the turnaround is like 3 to 5 days. So they'll tell you whether or not, really rapidly, whether they think that the project is interesting in their journal.
How to start the conversation with the editor?
With the pre-submission. So send
is
them.
that conversation, you call them up or you write them out?
People do both, but I think I would start with an email with either the letter of intent to submit, or the abstract, whatever you're going to ask them to look at. And then if you get a response that's very positive, go ahead and submit. If you get questions or comments, respond. Go back and say, well, if we were to do this, do you think that would make the paper appropriate for your journal?
But I would imagine they must receive tons of emails.
My experience
Maybe they
is
reply or
they're
email.
amazingly responsive.
Yeah, I've had good experience with these inquiries that are sometimes required for some of the journals we submit to. And if the editor has time, or I guess if they feel that the research is relevant enough, I've had one who's even suggested we alter our abstract to present more quantitative data in it to increase the priority, so that we'll have a higher likelihood of getting accepted later on once they go through the formal review process. So I think establishing those relationships are huge in making sure that your work gets published in the end.
And for the journals that actually pay their editors, that have staff editors like Science, Nature, Cell, that's their job. So they really are very responsive and will take the time. And then sometimes there are young and naive people, like I was when I became an editor of a journal, and they just want to help. And I used to respond to every email when I first started editing. And I remember one night having a long conversation with this investigator who just couldn't get his papers published. And I spent 2 hours on the phone with him talking through how to change his style and his approach to getting published. It turned out he was an engineer, and he just couldn't publish in the microbiology journals. And it was obvious to me why, it wasn't obvious to him. And it was one of the most satisfying experiences of my life because, you know, he wrote to me for years after saying, got another paper accepted, and I felt like I really made a difference. When I stopped having the time to do that, I found editorial work to be absolutely boring because I didn't feel like I was doing anything that 100 other people couldn't be doing.
As a really brief follow-up to that, as a graduate student, let's say potentially as a first author, is it appropriate for me to be writing those letters to the directly to the editor? Or, okay, so leave that in the room. Yeah. Okay, good.
So along those lines, what makes a great cover letter in your opinion?
I have no idea.
I think this gets back to the point we raised much earlier on about writing the abstract and taking it down even another notch to what's the bottom line take-home message? Why is this so exciting for that journal? You know, I'm writing to you, the editor of Journal X. Journal X is the perfect venue for my paper because, you know, what we talk about is exactly what your audience wants to hear about. You know, but you have to put this in very explicit terms. So I, as an editor, I like cover letters. They're short, but to the point, and really tell me why is this paper so important to my field. You know, you don't need to go through a lot of the data. That's what the paper is for. You don't need to go through the abstract. That's, you know, they're attached. But you do need to tell me why is this so important. That's what makes a good cover letter, in my opinion.
I've gone so far as to write a cover letter that said, in 1971 you published this paper that was so highly cited, and the paper that I'm submitting now is right along the lines of this work. It's also a new model, just like this one was, but progressing and hoping to progress the field in the same way. So kind of, you know, saying you're super cool and you did some super cool stuff. Let me help you be super cool. So I don't know if it made much of a difference, but they liked it and they allowed me to submit.
Basically, the subtext of what a cover letter is for is to help the editor. Because you want to tell them what the field is, why it's important, maybe even suggest some reviewers. If the journal doesn't require you to suggest reviewers, you can still use the cover letter to suggest some people in the field who might review your paper. And yeah, reference other work in the field that it's relevant to, you know, without belaboring it, but saying, you know, this is, you know, a follow-up on this really exciting work from 1970 or whatever. But, you know, sort of put it in context. Just, you know, a paragraph, that's fine.
It's kind of off topic, so should I wait to the end or?
Well, let's go to you in one moment. Before we get there, I just wanted to follow up. You said suggested reviewers. So what is your strategy in terms of how you pick suggested reviewers, or who you might specify that you prefer not to have in your paper? If you have any comments on those two decisions.
I actually have a sort of a rule of thumb. I never ask for people not to review my papers. I don't think I've ever asked for that, either on a grant review or a paper review. And you know, maybe it's my stubbornness, I have to say, because I feel like even somebody who I've competed with in the past should be fair-minded enough to review my paper on its merits. And if they have critical comments, I want to hear them. You know, I have faith in my work, and I want to hear the critical comments. And if they hit on something that I missed entirely, I want to hear about it before it's in the press.
I guess I have a slightly more cynical view. 10 years ago, I think I would have said the same thing, but today I think people are so busy that you get a lot of reviews that are just dumb reviews, that, you know, they raise points that you answered in the first paragraph of the paper. They didn't understand the data. I mean, people just aren't spending enough time, and I think that has changed. I think the review process is very broken, and it used to be much more effective. And so the result is that I think bias of all sorts, and it could be gender or race related, or it could just be because they're your competitor and they figure they're better than you are, can come in and they'll fill in the blanks of what they haven't actually read carefully in some negative way if they're a biased person. And so there are a very, very small number of people I will ask not to have review my papers, but it's very rare. The one paper actually that we did ask was the bias paper, because PNAS published a paper a year and a half ago by this group at Cornell that said there is no discrimination. That is a direct quote from the paper. And their argument was all that women leave science because of family reasons, childcare and others. And we quote them in the paper, and we know that they reviewed the paper for the first journal. We're absolutely sure of it because they denied that that quote was anywhere in the paper, and I don't think anyone would say that about someone else's paper. And then said this wasn't novel, and gave us 7 references of papers that had done the same thing. These papers were so off in left field and so not what we had done that one of them was on domestic violence. That's how far afield they were. So I think there's a level of dishonesty that has moved into the review process that I don't think is healthy, and I just say it to be realistic, that you have to be really careful. So people like that, if you have that experience, or if you've been an editor and you've read people's reviews, and that's one of the best ways to get insight, then you know, because there you can attach the name of the review, and you know that they're biased, or they make quick judgments, or they have what I call the poison pen, they just knock everything. Those are the people you may want to stay away from. But I would say, I agree, Vivian, that in general, it's rare to not want someone to review your paper.
I guess I would just say that the counterbalance of that is I really do try hard to find people to review, or suggest people to review my papers. They're not necessarily friends, but they're people whose authority in the field I respect a lot and who I know will do a conscientious effort. And that's really what I'm looking for.
Yeah, that's probably my model of suggesting reviewers. I haven't suggested anybody not to review my papers yet, but if I presented something at a conference and somebody was critical of it, and it may have been a good criticism that I've altered my manuscript to address those issues, that's definitely somebody I would list as a potential reviewer, because you want to have your paper, you want it to be good. You want, you know, if everybody's going to read it, then you want to make sure that you've addressed any holes that could have been in it early on. So critical review is good.
So I guess what's the best way to deal with the snippy reviewers, or like the reviews that you get back that this person clearly didn't actually read the paper because you answered that question in paragraph 1 and didn't learn anything? Like, how do you deal with that?
Just say it. Because as an editor, right? It's very hard to make the judgment.
I think the first thing is to spend 24 hours and not, read the reviews and then put them away for 24 hours and not respond immediately. Sometimes people who review jot things down really quickly, and the words they use may not accurately reflect what they mean. So those 24 hours are actually good, because you'll come back to you and say, what did they really mean? And maybe they actually had something there that's actually valid, but they didn't articulate it very well. So you have to sort of give that a chance to percolate. And then you can be very explicit in your response and say, well, if this is what they meant, this is how we're addressing it. However, if this is what they meant, we think this is irrelevant because we already discussed it in paragraph 1, or whatever.
So there's one question, I think, waiting.
Oh, yeah, this is sort of a possible gender question about your name, and if you change your name at some point in your career, like get married and you want to change your name, is that a common thing? Do people do that? I mean, could that hinder you if you have a different name in your graduate degree, to your postdoc, to your becoming a professor? Like, do people have a work name and then a home name? How do people kind of deal with that?
I always tell my students and postdocs not to change their names, at least professionally. First reason is that if you've already published, then you have papers under different names, and you really want the continuity of name recognition. And so I think it can hurt you in that sense. But the other thing is, and this is just incredibly cynical, and nobody ever wants to hear it at the time they're getting married, but it's true that close to 50% of marriages end in divorce. So you have a reasonable chance of not wanting that name someday and changing again in science. It's really not good, because then it'll be much deeper into your career. And you don't want to be stuck with a name that has bad connotations.
This goes back to the idea of like the review process. How often do you think it is that professors just give the paper to their graduate students to review, and that leads to the bad reviews?
I think graduate students tend to do much better jobs
Really?
in a lot of cases.
Because I feel like I would be an utterly incompetent reviewer.
That probably means you'd be a great reviewer, because you'd be so worried that you would spend hours and days.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I've often heard that, the more junior you are, the harsher you are at reviewing grants, right, papers, you're really in the science, you're doing it on a daily basis, so you understand the feasibility of an assay, and you understand what the outcome should look like. So I think you can pick out some details that somebody who's a little further removed from that experience would miss. So I think you're underselling yourself.
So we have just a couple more minutes left before we'll finish up. Are there other questions? Burning question?
Actually, we should have probably done this at the beginning instead of the end, but how many of you have actually published something already?
First author or any author?
Had some impact on the writing and the publication process? You're still willing to try it?
I have one more question sorry, I've been talking a lot, I know, but so many questions. For the people who have been editors, how much, I guess you've been an editor-in-chief, how much impact does that have, do you have on what goes on for the journal? I mean, I assume you have a lot, but what does that actually look like?
It depends on the organization. So I've been an editor in a public or a nonprofit journal, and then a private company journal. And the private company one, they offered me the opportunity to sort of reconfigure the journal, reimagine what the journal could be, and told me I could do anything I wanted. And I did some pretty unusual things. I don't know if I've had much of an impact as an editor of other more mainstream, more traditional relationships where you're really carrying on what's been done before. I think new journals, the editors and editors-in-chief have incredible power and influence to create a whole new vision. That's the biggest impact.
Are you meaning on the scope and the vision of the journal, or on individual papers?
Yeah, I mean, I guess just how much interface does the editor have with the papers that go through it?
Well, it depends on editor-in-chief or editor. The editors, and usually the editor-in-chief has this as well, they will decide on the reviewers, and then they will decide how to interpret the reviews. So that in that sense, on individual papers, I think it's an enormous impact. The editor-in-chief doesn't have a lot in many journals beyond that. I mean, sometimes if it's a journal where the board meets every year, all the editors meet, sometimes the editor-in-chief can propose certain standards, like, okay, let's agree that if we don't have X done, we're just not going to accept the paper, or we no longer accept just sequence papers, or whatever the issue may be. But other than that, a lot of journals don't give the editor-in-chief enough leeway to do anything really big.
Well, thank you so much for your comments. We actually have small gifts for the four of you. Maybe not so small. So their bags here, Google Center. So, maybe we can